Prelude. Dr. Ansari moved around his basement apartment. He'd searched high and low for an apartment like this. A windowless box with a large open floor plan, perfect for setting up the large glass terrariums which kept his life's work safe from prying eyes. The only separate room in the entire apartment was the bathroom, which was divided by a somewhat ratty curtain. Ansari had long ago resigned himself to living a Spartan lifestyle for the sake of his work. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do to ensure its success. Yes, it was perfect. Perfect for his work. Work that he knew, one way or another, would redefine modern science and possibly even humanity. If only those in academia shared his opinion, but those nearsighted fools had lacked true ambition and backbone to make genuine change. They'd kicked him out of the university and laughed at his ideas. Some even went as far to call him a mad scientist. Like all men of progress, he could only shoulder the insult, thinking about how Tesla and those before him were probably labeled the same with equally vicious zeal. What real scientist had time to wait for proper procedure before experimentation? Life was too fleeting for work where the permits alone would take years to get, not to mention government regulations and oversight. No, Dr. Ansari was finished with academia. Much like those tech barons that carved an alternative path for themselves away from judgmental eyes, only to build empires, he'd created his own personal lab. The resources of which had nearly broken him, but luckily he'd been able to MacGyver much of what he'd needed. And without grants or an administration board to answer to, he had no oversight, so he could do as he pleased how he pleased. The apartment was cramped, filled top to bottom with large glass cages. Cages which held his babies, his hungry, hungry babies. They were his most prized possessions, and were the physical representation of years of research. The first 2 years, of course, had been trying to secure the perfect living specimens in which to apply his serum. The next were spent trying to get them to breed. Earlier batches of serum 119 had the side effect of sterilization. The second had made the test subjects hyper-aggressive and had taken breeding off the table. The hardest thing, though, had been keeping them from dying off to begin with. Dr. Ansari hadn't ever been into keeping pets, so keeping other creatures alive and thriving had been a learning curve in itself. Trial and error had been the name of the game. That and, of course, calling in every favor he had left to pay the rent. He'd even sunk as low as taking odd jobs, which in his case meant driving for several carpool apps. Things that 5 years ago had been so beneath him, he would have turned his nose up at the idea. Perched as he was on his stained love seat drinking rather stale coffee and letting his mind stray, Dr. Ansari could already feel his life coming back together. Soon he'd be relishing the fruits of his labor. And then he'd go back to living the lifestyle he deserved. As soon as the next brood specimens were viable, he could sell them all off. Already, he'd had several offers from those he'd shared some videos of his test results with on the dark web. People who didn't sneer at progress and were all too willing to pay for it. People who were more than willing to pay his asking price and then some. Once that happened, he'd prove to his hecklers that he had been correct all along. Yes, no more stale coffee and Salvation Army clothes for him. It would be back to the real world and tenure, probably even those all too lucrative government contracts that would keep him wealthy for years. Sometimes he'd wanted to quit and would have taken any reason to just walk away, but something had kept driving him. Maybe it was madness after all, he thought with a small laugh. Like those damn small-minded officials who had destroyed his first specimens and had him thrown from the comfortable world of academia. Well, he would show them. Yes, he would show them all. How foolish they would all look when his name was once again back in the textbooks where it belonged. A low melodic hissing noise sounded from the cages, letting him know that what was inside was hungry. Very hungry. He thought solemnly, watching them crawl over one another. The bottom of each cage becoming a moving mass of small carapace bodies. At some point, he'd have to work on the current batch of serum. It performed perfectly, but it seemed to make his babies extra ravenous. He'd go as far to call them downright feral with hunger. It had gotten to where he was feeding them almost as much as 3 times a day. How had he forgotten feeding time? Luckily for him, they always knew when feeding time was. Taking some raw chicken from out of the sink, he deftly deposited it in all the cages, being careful as so none of its inhabitants could escape. That would be disastrous for everyone. He watched them devour it, their small bodies scurrying over the raw meat as their greedy mouths tore ragged chunks from it in quick procession. In less than 2 minutes, there was no chicken left in any of the cages. They were growing up so fast by next week they could reproduce. Ansari sighed. He'd have to get more terrariums and shipping boxes. Then he'd need to sell some of them sooner rather than later. Their reproduction would be his final product. All of his dreams come true. He couldn't wait to see the companies that would line up and offer him money for them. Smiling, he made his way back to the love seat that also served as his bed. From the way his back hurt these days, that was another change that needed to be made. He certainly wasn't getting any younger, and his age was quickly catching up with him. His work certainly hadn't made him any younger. Immortality. Yes, now that was a worthy goal. Too bad everybody else chased that pipe dream. Dr. Ansari had to drape sheets over top of the cages before he went to sleep. As of late, he would swear that they were watching him, studying every little thing that he did. But that, of course, was nonsense. They were being made to take orders, to survive, not to learn. Still, it was unnerving, especially with the way they hissed when he would try to sleep. Like they were communicating between the cages, but that was impossible. With that question on his mind, Dr. Ansari slowly fell into a dreamless sleep. And as soon as he fell asleep, the entire room was filled with hissing from cage to cage, and the sound of lots of little legs scurrying around them. 1. Frank's eyes felt like they were going to melt out of his head. As usual, he was still up in the middle of the night, running off caffeine well after most sane people had gone to bed, trying to finish just a little more code. At least that's what he told himself. In theory, he could have finished his work hours ago. Frank was a productive procrastinator. At least that's what he told himself, when in reality it just meant that he started more projects than he finished and quickly tried to meet deadlines at the last minute. He used to joke and say that sleep was for the weak. But that had been back when he had been using his time productively and hadn't had what looked like a decade of rings under his eyes. What now felt like centuries ago. It wasn't like he could help it. That was one problem with being an entrepreneur. Especially one that in recent years had become somewhat of a loner. Another thing that wasn't entirely his fault. He'd moved cities and his friends had drifted after college to places that could further their own careers or were cheap enough to settle down. A thing that had been bound to happen to everyone, given time. They no longer shared the same interests, and though they didn't say it, many of them resented his success. As his wealth had accumulated, and they still had to punch in at a 9-to-5 job, he'd noticed a change. Mostly they stopped inviting him out, or when they talked to him at all. Their only topic of conversation was his personal wealth. Constant speculation about how lucrative his projects were, with more than a hint of jealousy in their voices. Now they had kids and lives, and well, he had disposable income and a top-floor apartment in Baltimore where he could watch the city lights and work on his projects. Projects that had worn on him as time went on, becoming less of a way to make money and more of a way to stay busy. So here he was, 38 years old, overweight and living in a large apartment all by himself. In a place most people didn't want to walk streets in, let alone choose to live. But hey, he got along great with the super and he liked his neighbors well enough. Those he knew at least. Most of them didn't linger in the halls of the building. Unlike him, their lives weren't confined to the front doors. Though he loved that part as well, that no one here gave a shit about who he was. Sunnyvale Apartments certainly wasn't the newest apartment building, but it's where he liked to call home. And besides, just because you had money didn't mean you had to spend it by living some crazy lavish lifestyle. There was only so much he could buy that he'd actually use. All he really needed was a computer. He'd seen too many people like him go broke, allowing lifestyle creep to take place, or worse, living well among their means. Another division amongst his one-time peers. After all, it was his money, and if he wanted to use it to play video games and write about conspiracy theories on his blog, then so be it. Besides, at least he had some friends on Reddit. Online, though they may be, but in the modern world with its crazy amount of problems, that wasn't a bad thing. Which is why, at 2 in the morning, he was listening to the dying rattles of the air being forced through the ducts. He made a note of that on the sticky pad in front of him. He would bring it to Mr. Jamier's attention tomorrow. He and the old man got along pretty well, and being the landlord, he always seemed to like it when Frank told him things like that. Not that Frank purposely looked for things out of place. Over time, it had just become a sort of habit. So whenever he saw or heard something that needed to be fixed or was out of place, he wrote it down to tell Mr. Jamier, or if he couldn't find him, he told the super, Will Jemson. That was, of course, if he could find him or if he was sober. Which was why, over time, Frank had learned to fix a lot of the things in the building. He'd always been good at tinkering, and it had gotten to where some of his neighbors in the building came to him first, probably because, like him, they knew Will was going to take his sweet time when it came to fixing stuff. Maybe he should stretch his legs and see if he bumped into him. Who knows, maybe Willie was a night owl like he was. Though he doubted it, checking the time, Frank realized that the bars had closed hours ago, and Will was most likely in his bed sleeping off a good night of drinking. Most people were trying to get out of the Sunnyvale Apartments as quick as they could. Not that they were in a terrible neighborhood or anything. It was just they were ordinary, or as his neighbor Brittany once put it, they were for people stuck in life. People that were fine not trying to go anywhere at all. She referred to living here as settling, and was just bidding her time before a promotion in the firm that she worked for that would allow her to move to uptown. Into one of the trendier, newer lofts that seemed to crop up all over the city. The complacent, that's what they were. Frank had understood that she had meant it to sound harsh. Brittany was always self-depreciating like that, but Frank never saw the place as she did. He always thought of the place as being modest. In those new buildings, he doubted that people even knew who owned them, let alone who their neighbors were. He felt safe here. He liked it. And maybe that was a problem, but it was one he was fine having. Or maybe the problem is that you've been staring at this screen for the last 6 hours, typing away like a madman, and reading about encounters with black-eyed children. He thought, leaning back in his ergonomic office chair and rubbing his straining eyes. Yeah, that could definitely be a problem too. He thought, then yawned and stretched back against his chair. The movement pushed his belly up tight against his desk, making it rock, and sending several empty cans of Mountain Dew onto the floor. The cans echoed loudly against the tile floor, making the apartment seem emptier than it was. He should have turned on the TV for background sound. Just thinking about that made him feel even lonelier. He got up then and grabbed his laundry basket. It was overflowing and a little too ripe. Once again, he had been putting it off without meaning to. Just another one of those things that seemed to add up more and more lately. Damn it. He never meant to procrastinate, and for the most part, he didn't, not when it came to work anyway. Like launching new websites or designing apps or games, that kind of stuff he could always find time for. Things he did more for pleasure than profit these days. No, it was the everyday stuff that seemed to add up. Like washing the dishes, or cleaning up around the apartment, or like tonight's conundrum doing laundry. With a sigh, he slipped on his sandals. His mother would have a fit if she saw him now walking around in hoodie, basketball shorts, and flip-flops where people could see. But hey, he was just going down a couple floors to do laundry. Who was he trying to impress? Hefting the basket, he exited his apartment, leaving all the lights on. Something about coming back home to dark rooms freaked him out too much to do otherwise. Once outside, he sat the basket down in the hall and locked all the locks. He had 3 just in case, along with a bevy of keys. Maybe he was a little paranoid. In the 10 years since he had lived here, no one had ever broken in. He was starting to wonder if he was slowly becoming agoraphobic. Could that happen? He wondered. Deciding that the exercise might do him some good, Frank decided to take the stairs. He pushed open the door and almost went back to the elevator. The light in the stairwell had flickered. That had to be some kind of ill omen, right? Frank wondered and then swallowed down his fear. Reading all of those stories had made him paranoid. That being said, if he saw a creepy child on the stairs, he was hauling ass as fast as he could, and his laundry would just have to wait. It was just the late hour and lack of sleep getting to him. That was all, he reminded himself. The lights on the other floors worked fine. It was just the one on the 5th floor that seemed to have a mind of its own. Something else to make a note of. He'd have to let someone know about that. What if someone fell on the stairs and hurt themselves because the light was out? Damn, he forgot his notepad and his cell phone. Well, he would just have to do his best to remember. He was already sweating and a little out of breath when he got to the first floor. Had he really let himself get this out of shape? He thought as he caught his breath. He hadn't even noticed it. Frank had, after all, been quite fit once, not weighing an ounce over 180 of lean muscle. Hell, he even ran track in college. Now, here he was a decade and some change later, having to stop and catch his breath just from walking down a flight of stairs while carrying a laundry basket. He needed to take better care of himself. It wasn't like he was getting any younger, and 40 was coming up fast. With an effort, he could pull himself together and make his way along the faded white concrete walls of the first floor, which differed from the faded white pressboard ones on all the other floors. Still cheap for the time it was built, but he liked to think it was probably more sturdy than whatever they built with now. The laundry room was down at the opposite end of the hall, away from the elevator and stairway. It was far from fancy. No, it definitely wasn't that. It was just a small room filled with coin-operated washers and dryers. But hey, it saved him from having to leave his building, and to Frank, that was everything. He was just about done with his laundry when he caught sight of something scuttle under one of the dryers. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a cockroach, and a big one at that. He quickly stepped out and smashed it flat before it could get away. In all the time that he had lived here, he had never seen one in the building. Mr. Jameer had always prided himself on the fact that this building never had a roach infestation, as long as he had owned it. Another thing to talk to Mr. Jameer about, thought Frank, almost miserably, knowing how much it was going to upset the old man who he counted as one of his friends. One of the few that he had in real life. Before he could head back upstairs, though, he bumped into Dr. Ansari, who looked harried as usual. If Frank was a shut-in, then Dr. Ansari was a downright hermit. The other man barely came up from the basement apartment he called home. At least Frank left the apartment occasionally, even if it was just to go to stuff around the building. Ansari smiled when he saw him. They'd always been on good terms. The man was a biologist and Frank a software engineer, so they'd both bonded over being too smart for their own good. Today, however, Dr. Ansari, as he liked to be called, looked worse than normal. He had deep dark bags under his eyes. Ones that were so severe they could be made out in his otherwise ruddy brown complexion. The man looked like he hadn't slept in months. "Frank, my friend, how are you?" "Good," Frank said, doing his best not to stare. Ansari was wearing a lab coat with a t-shirt and pajama pants under them, with slippers on his feet, none of which looked like they'd been washed in a long time. He was aggressively feeding quarters into a snack machine. "How are you doing?" Frank asked him. "Me? I couldn't be better. It's all coming together now. Mark my words, Frank, everything's going to change soon," he said with a strange smile, before turning his attention hungrily to the honey bun that was just starting to drop. "Oh, I'm okay," Frank said. "Hey, have you seen any roaches in the basement by chance? I just saw one in the laundry room." "Roaches? Roaches? Never, but tell me, the one you saw in the laundry room, was it big?" he asked, gripping Frank by the shoulders. "Yeah, I guess it was pretty big," Frank stuttered. Dr. Ansari let go of him. "Is it dead?" Frank nodded, and Ansari let out his breath. "Excellent. Well, it's the city, you know, they come in through the cracks. I'm sure there isn't anything to worry about," Ansari told him, and then lovingly scooped up his honey bun before scampering back toward the door that would take him down into the basement. Frank shook his head, wondering if he should call someone about the Dr. Ansari's erratic behavior. But who would he call? As far as he knew, in all the years that he'd lived here, Ansari had never had a single visitor. Frank shrugged and turned to head back to the elevator. That was enough walking around for one night. 2. The next morning came earlier than Frank would have liked. His alarm started blaring right at 7 a.m. He felt like he'd just set it before laying down to sleep, and now it was already going off. Angrily, he reached out to press sleep, only to find that he'd set it across the room, knowing that if he didn't, he wouldn't have gotten up. Why the hell had he set it so early? He wondered as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. But he knew part of it was also that he wanted to straighten out his sleep schedule. There was another reason, though. He'd needed to do something. But now he couldn't remember what. Sitting up, he rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and tried to remember. That's right. He had to talk to Mr. Jameer about the roach issue and maybe the super too. Even if it was to tell him just to keep an eye out for them. The last thing this building needed was a full-blown infestation. He had even talked to some people online last night, and they had talked for hours about all the government-controlled diseases that roaches could spread. Now Frank realized that he might have gone way too far down the rabbit hole the other night. As if he didn't have enough to worry about his life as it was. Just another reminder of how dangerous the world was, and another reason for him to stay within the confines of his apartment. He'd thought about leaving and getting a case of Raid to spray around his apartment, but on second thought, he was just going to order some off the internet. No sense leaving the building if he didn't have to. He told himself, once again finding a reason against going out. Showering quickly, Frank grabbed a bowl of cereal before heading downstairs. At first he couldn't find it. He had forgotten that after throwing his laundry on the couch, he had put all his dry goods inside the fridge to keep them safe from roaches, even though he hadn't seen any in his apartment. You never could be too safe. If you saw one, there was probably a bunch more you didn't see. He'd never dealt with roaches before, but that's what he'd always heard about them. No sense taking any unnecessary risks. In hindsight, it had been the right decision, but it had given his cereal a stale flavor that no amount of milk and sugar could fix. He put on jeans and a polo that were just a little too small, like most of his clothes. They were things he'd had since college. On second thought, he took the polo off and put on a button-up shirt that was a little too big. It had been one of those online orders where he'd done his best to guess the size. He was too old to be wearing the same polos from college all the time, and too big in the middle to wear tight ones. Hell, he hadn't even been anywhere in a long time where he would even need to wear a shirt with a collar. Thinking of it, he couldn't even remember the last time he'd bought new clothes for that matter. Taking one last look at himself, he left his apartment and headed out the door, not happy with how big he was looking in his own mirror. With a longing look over towards the stairs, Frank walked over to the elevator because it was faster. Plus, he didn't want to sweat through his clothes, and there was no sense in him being out of breath before he even talked to anyone. Besides, he could always start working out tomorrow. Like clockwork, every Thursdays Mr. Jameer came in to empty all the changes from the laundry rooms. Then usually either Frank or Will helped him to load it into his old Lincoln Town car. Usually giving them both a quarter for their efforts, something that always made him laugh. He knew Mr. Jameer meant well, and he enjoyed helping the older man out when he could. The elevator dinged at the ground floor, and Frank found Mr. Jameer and Will Jemson heading into the laundry room. His large burlap bags clutched in his hands, waiting to be filled. Frank stopped to look at them. Mr. Jameer's age was starting to show. His hairline had thinned noticeably, and his shoulders were more slumped than usual. It even looked like he may have dropped 20 or so pounds. He pushed his glasses up when he saw Frank coming towards them and smiled. "Frank, my boy, you're right on time to give us a hand," Mr. Jameer said warmly as Frank approached. Frank knew that Mr. Jameer was old, but today was the first day that he actually looked at it. "Good morning, Mr. Jameer, Will," Frank said, hoping his voice didn't sound too clipped when he greeted Will Jemson. Will just grunted in reply. Frank couldn't stand that man no matter how much he tried. As long as he had lived here, he had never understood why Mr. Jameer trusted him so much. The man was a lazy and tried to not do his job as much as possible. On top of everything else, he was a drunk. Frank had long ago lost count of all the times he'd talked to the man while he reeked of liquor. Not to mention the fact that he had always been overly antagonistic towards Frank since he moved in. Probably because he was quick to point things out to the owner. Will simply grunted at him as he walked up, further clarifying that there wasn't any love lost on his side either. "Mr. Jameer, I wanted to talk to you about something." Frank started clearing his throat before pressing on, knowing that he'd have to tread carefully. "Sure, anything, Frank," Mr. Jameer said, warmly patting him on the back as they walked into the laundry room. "Now, Mr. Jameer, you know I don't like to cause trouble," he replied, "or raise a false alarm. What, you never? Will gawked sarcastically before Mr. Demir shushed him. Frank, whatever it is you tell me. You know you're my eyes and ears around here, Mr. Demir said, clapping him on the back again and giving Will a stern look. Well, I saw a roach down here last night, Frank told him. Will groaned, already seeing the added workload of his already busy day. Mr. Demir clucked and shook his head. I've always done my best to keep this a clean place. You both know that. But living in this city, it was bound to happen. Probably came in with one of the new tenants. Kids these days don't know squat about keeping a place clean. I warn them to watch what they bring in here, but they never listen. Used furniture, stacks of pizza boxes, you wouldn't believe it. I ever tell you about the couple that used to get all their furniture from dumpster diving? He continued, wagging a finger at them. And then these slumlords buy the buildings on either side of me, and they don't care if the places stay clean. It's the times I'm telling you all. Frank and Will just nodded their heads, knowing better than to interrupt Mr. Demir when he was on a roll. Well, don't you worry, Frank. Will here will get right to the bottom of this. He'll kill all them bugs, not a problem, he told them. Will just grunted and nodded tiredly. Frank had a feeling that it probably would not get done. But at least he had done his part. He helped them empty the change and earned his quarter. He helped Mr. Demir back into his car as Will walked back into the building, muttering under his breath. Frank knew he was pissed, but hey, it wasn't his fault if the man hadn't done his job well enough to prevent this all from happening in the first place. He walked back inside and almost walked right into Candy. She was dressed in a pair of white shorts that barely covered anything, and a low-cut tank top she was almost popping out of. Her long dyed blonde hair was in a long braid that sat on her shoulder. She laughed when Frank apologized, making her hoop earrings jingle along with her laugh. Frank felt himself blush. Something about Candy always made him feel nervous and on edge. Frank, she chimed. You were just the man I was looking for. Really? Frank all but squeaked as he tried to find his voice and keep his eyes from wandering. Yes, really, you old knucklehead, she said, looping her arm in his and pulling him towards the elevator. I'm having a problem with my computer, you know. And I thought to myself, Candy, who do you know that's just a whiz with stuff like this? The name Frank was the only one I could think of, she said, as though it were obvious. Sure, Candy, that's no problem. Do you know what's wrong with it? She shrugged again, causing the strap on her right shoulder to slide down her arm, revealing even more of her cleavage and making Frank's throat go dry. He looked straight ahead as he felt all the blood rush from his face. Candy laughed again. I don't know, it's just not working right, but I know you can fix it for me, Frank. She said his name with an odd purr. That made Frank feel like he was trapped. Candy lived on the same floor as Frank. She just lived closer to the elevator than he did. Apartment 4E, Candy's Stevicle. And truth be told, none of them knew if that was her real name. Hell, Frank had given up trying to guess her actual hair color a year ago. She opened the door and pulled him inside. Her apartment was smaller than Frank's. He never knew what she did for a living, and he never asked. Candy made him feel so uncomfortable most of the time, he tried to run in the opposite direction as soon as he saw her. All around the walls were draped with Christmas lights, clothes and shopping bags littered the floor. His eyes were immediately drawn to the very large flat-screen television and gaming systems sitting in front of the small, hot pink couch. If he wasn't here for business, he'd be beelining over there and going through her game collection. You'll approve, I take it? Candy asked, her eyebrow arched, clearly amused. I'm more of a PC gamer myself, but I have a couple of console titles, he replied, taking a seat at her kitchen table. I only use my laptop for porn personally, Candy said offhanded, causing Frank to almost choke. She laughed. You okay, hotshot? He could only nod. Yeah, I'm fine. That's probably the cause of your problems, he told her in a faint breath, realizing that he really needed to get out more. She laughed. It was a pleasant sound. No, silly, she said, sitting beside him on the couch. I film it. He almost spit the cold Coca-Cola all over the laptop, but somehow managed to get it down. Oh, I'm okay. It's great money, actually, she confided. Only problem is I spend most of time alone up in this apartment, No real work friends or anything like that. Now that was something he could understand. I get it. Trust me, you work so hard to break away from the day job only to trade one cage for another. She flashed her smile at him. Exactly. Hey, do you want to go get a beer? Like outside of the building? He asked her. She nodded. Yeah, I'd like that a lot. Maybe he'd have a reason to put on that collared shirt after all. Good, she said, smiling at him. Fixing her laptop didn't take long at all, and soon he was back out the door, wondering what the hell had just happened. One thing was sure, he was really glad that he'd done laundry yesterday. Skipping the elevator, he all but sprinted back to his apartment to get ready for the night. 3. Ansari hadn't slept well in the last 3 nights. It wasn't his fault. Sleeping was too dangerous now, and he knew that they were listening and watching. Always watching, and clamoring on the glass, and following his every move around the apartment. What was he supposed to do now? Destroy his entire life's research? That was unthinkable. All of his savings were gone at this point. He couldn't afford to start over, even if he wanted to. He was positive that not only were they talking to one another, but some had escaped. At first he hadn't known how. He'd stayed up watching them, not turning off the lights. But he was unable to catch them in the act. Luckily, what his eyes couldn't detect, cameras did. That and the sounds. Hissing but quieter, like they were communicating with each other through the walls. After hours of footage, he discovered they were working together. The roaches would scale the cages and then help push each other out one at a time. He figured it was so that way he wouldn't notice the numbers going down. Until it was too late, that was. He swallowed at the thought, and just for a minute, he wondered if his old associates had been right. They'd decided that he had no right to play God, but maybe somewhere in their tiny brains they had already seen a danger that he had not. One that his ambition wouldn't let him see. And now it was too late. They'd waited for him to go to sleep, and had only let so many through the small openings at the top of the grate, forming ladder-like mounds with their bodies, even though it meant that some would be suffocated to death in the attempt. All things that meant that his creations were far too smart. Ansari didn't like the implications of what they were doing. To his way of thinking, they were planning something. And whatever it was, obviously didn't include him. With a sigh, he decided, realizing that no matter what, he'd like to believe there was no other way. Not anymore. His creations were too far gone. If they were trying to escape, it could only mean that they now saw him as a threat. Even the ones who saw him as a giver of food would turn on him. The ones that feared him would turn even more quickly for the good of the hive. Part of him was proud of that fact, because it meant that he'd made them smarter than anyone ever thought was possible. They were thinking beyond a hive mind, beyond simple pheromones. Some, if not all of them, were now capable of some surface-level individuality, according to several tests he'd run, which became only more clear given what he'd seen in the film. The ones that left and the ones that stayed. He smiled. They were making choices. If he had a more secure lab, he'd let them continue. That way, he could test the results. This batch was showing itself to be superior in every way. It was a shame to destroy them when they should be studied. But the consequences of letting them live at this stage was terrifying to imagine. Hopefully, he'd have a second chance to try again in the future. In a better facility, he thought, looking around his squalid apartment. One where he'd be safely far away from the creatures he created. He'd have to track down the missing ones, of course. Easy enough, he'd simply offer to help the landlord in gassing the premises. Already, the super had been down here asking questions about roaches. Luckily, his escaped creations hadn't left the apartment complex, making their eradication a little easier. It had taken him 4 years to get to this point. There had been some interest online from shadier buyers than he'd like. But maybe he could convince one of them to fund another batch. If he'd have had the equipment, he could have frozen some. Kept a good working biological sample from this colony to work from later. Either way, there would hopefully be enough genetic materials between the colonies that he'd be able to salvage something. He'd taken the research as far as he could. He couldn't let himself forget what he'd made. They were weapons, plain and simple. Living, crawling weapons, ones that were made to infiltrate cities and devastate armies, and ones that were now sadly getting out of his control. Ansari couldn't bring himself to put more people in danger for the sake of science. No matter what people said about him, he wasn't a monster. With God knows how many of the roaches were already moving around the building, the other renters were already in enough danger. If anything happened to them, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. With a sigh, he knew it was time. There was no point in prolonging the inevitable. He sat down and made sure all of his notes were in order, just in case anything went wrong. Then he did his best not to panic, not wanting the roaches to pick up on the change in his pheromones, the ones that would let them know he was panicking or about to go into action. The hissing from the tanks calmed down. The roaches seemed to stop moving around as much as he stood up from his chair, making it all too clear that they were watching his moves closely. It was almost like they wanted him to know. Time was now of the essence. If they could plan enough to sneak themselves out one by one, then he knew they could easily swarm over the sides. He'd only get one chance to do this. Right now, he was still seen as a provider. The minute they realized he was an immediate threat, his creations would destroy him just as easily as he would destroy them. Even the ones that feared him and refused to escape would join the others out of sheer need for survival. Just like he made them too. A fitting fate, he gulped. Grabbing the canister he kept under his desk, he went to the first cage. Lifting the top and the spray at the same time, he filled the cage with the poisonous brew. The roaches hissed, only to fall silent as they died. Others hissed. The second cage tried to rise up, but he was ready for them. The sprayer nozzle held out as he pumped more and more of the stuff into the cage and around the apartment. Beside him, the third cage smashed to the ground. The roaches, instead of trying to pour out of the top like he'd had expected, instead rushed the sides. Putting such force on it, they knocked the cage over and onto the concrete floor. As soon as it hit, the glass shattered and they scattered. Glass and swarming panicked roaches spilled out all over the floor. He sprayed all around like a wild man. Seeing the success of the others, the fourth and fifth cages followed suit. This time he was expecting it, and many of them died as he sprayed them before they could flee their shattered terrariums. Ansari started to choke and cough as the fumes hit him. His eyes watered. He was so concerned with those running all around him that Ansari failed to notice what the other surviving roaches had done. Thinking that they'd take the first shot they got to run into the vents, he'd stop paying attention to them. Instead, they barreled around him faster than he could spray. The survivors swarmed over him, all too happy to sacrifice their own lives in the attempt to get him. Ansari screamed out in pain as hundreds of tiny insect mouths bored into him. As soon as he stopped spraying to swat at them, the thousands that had survived swarmed him as well. Some even ventured from the safety of the vents to pile on. A veritable tide of thumb-sized dark insect bodies descended onto him. The roaches eating and tearing into his skin, as he opened his mouth to scream again, only to have them crawl inside. Their tiny little legs creeping over his tongue and tickling his throat as they tunneled inside of him. Eyes, ears, nose, any way to devour him they took. But Ansari was already gone, his mind going numb with shock long before his body was dead on the ground, covered in a thick blanket of little moving bodies. The camera in the corner filming it all, for the good doctor who was no longer around to watch it. 4. He'd just gotten ready, realizing that none of his clothes fit him right. He'd still owned some of the same collared shirts he'd had since college. They'd been baggy on him then, but now they were tight in all the wrong places. Another thing that Frank hadn't thought about until now. He hoped he wouldn't have to raise his arms higher than chest level tonight, because if so, his belly was gonna pop out. Candy beamed at him when opened the door. She was dressed in a slim-fitting black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places and had his jaw on the floor. "Wow, you look amazing," he said, trying not to trip over himself. "Good boy," she said with a smile. "At some point, though, we've got to talk about your style." He sighed. "I was thinking the same thing myself. I guess there is a bit of an age limit for neon polos and boat shoes, huh?" "Just a little." She chuckled, then looped her arm through his. "But we'll work on it." They made small talk all the way down the elevator, but with each floor they passed, his heart beat faster and faster. Soon they'd be on the ground floor. And once they were there, they'd have to walk outside on the street where there was going to be people everywhere. People who'd judge him, and well, Frank did his best to stop thinking about that. "Are you okay?" Candy asked him as they walked out of the elevator. Yeah, I'll be fine," he muttered as he started to sweat profusely. Something else that he'd been trying not to think about. They made almost to the door before he started shaking. His heart was hammering into his chest. "Frank, do you not want to go out with me?" Candy asked him, coming to a stop right by the doors. "No, it's not that," Frank said, panicking. "It's just, I have a problem being out of the building. Like it all." "Oh, Frank," she sighed. I didn't want to say anything, because I really thought I could do it," he told her, embarrassed. "And now I've let you down." "No," she said sternly. "You haven't. Trust me, if agoraphobia is the worst you've got going on, let's just say that's a pretty minor red flag in my book. I'll tell you some stories sometimes. Now come on, I didn't get dressed up for nothing, mister." "What?" he asked as she turned him back around. "You've got an Xbox and a phone, so you're getting us a pizza, and I'm going to kick your ass at your own games, and then we're going to watch a movie," she told him with a smile. Frank was flabbergasted as he followed her back to the elevator. "You're really not mad?" "Nope, it's just something we'll have to work on one step at a time," she told him with a wink and led him back upstairs. The pizza came a little while later, and after losing several matches of multiple games against her, Frank spilled the details about how he couldn't leave. "How'd it start?" she asked. He shrugged and grabbed himself another beer as they sat on the couch together. "Gradually, I guess. Some friends and I made an app in college that took off. After that, everything sort of became super crazy. I mean, we couldn't even walk out the door without having cameras in our face for a couple years. The buzz died down, but a lot of the online hate didn't. Some people were mad at us for making money so young, and don't even get me started on the people that either wanted money from us or were constantly pestering us for our next great idea." "Sounds like hell for a computer geek," Candy replied. He nodded. "I mean, I know many people probably wouldn't feel that way, but it was awful. We weren't setting out to make a bunch of money. We were just a bunch of coders that made something, so we'd have a portfolio after we graduated. It just happened to get popular for a little while. The guy that I first made it with, Yoren, he got so depressed that he ended up killing himself. He was my best friend, and he just couldn't handle it. And I couldn't talk to anyone about it because they just saw me as successful, so they'd say I was ungrateful." "Fuck them," Candy said sternly. He smiled. "Yeah, fuck them. Then after that, I moved out here and just kind of shut myself away. Soon I started going out less and less, until I didn't go out at all. When I would try to go out, I'd start having anxiety about it, to where I'd get to the front door and just couldn't breathe. So it just got easier not to try at all." She reached over and grabbed his hand. "Well, maybe you just didn't have a good enough reason to leave." "Maybe," he said, smiling at her. "Now, you ready for me to kick your ass again, or what?" she asked, picking up a controller and patting the seat beside her. He smiled, grabbing them both another drink from the fridge and sitting back beside her. Maybe things were looking up after all. 5. It was around 9 p.m. when Brittany returned home from work. Another day, managing a call center where she tried to motivate employees to sell stuff that people neither needed nor wanted. Their major products being rip-offs of as seen on TV style junk. Another day where she felt like she was wasting her business degree. Now she was home looking at another one of those long nights spent reading Forbes and drinking glass after glass of boxed wine. Those nights where if she got drunk enough, she could almost imagine herself on the cover. Some big-shot CEO of a Fortune 500 company, where inside it would feature one of those 8-page success stories. Only that's not quite how life worked out. She'd had a few amazing internships in college, but the actual offers never came, and she wound up stuck in middle management with everyone else without the right connections. Just another cog in the machine, one that rarely got noticed unless something was wrong, or it was time for another round of layoffs. But hey, at least she lived in the city, unlike everyone who she went to high school with. All of them still stuck in their hometown out in the middle of nowhere. Though she was all alone, she reminded herself as she went to grab her wine glass. Her love life had about as much excitement as her current career. Uncorking tonight's bottle of Pinot Noir, some new blend she'd picked up at the bodega on her way home, a brief change from the usual bottom shelf boxes. She laughed to herself as she took her first sip. The longest relationship she had going right now was with her Hitachi in the drawer by her bed. After drinking half a glass, she started running a bath, filling it with bath bombs and salts. Anything that would help her relax. Something she felt she needed now more than ever. Going into her bedroom, she changed into a flowery silk robe. Something she'd bought because she'd fallen in love with how it had felt against her skin. Because really, what was the point of working all the time if you didn't treat yourself every now and again? Brittany had always loved nice things. Growing up in Indiana, she hadn't been able to have them. But here in Baltimore, it was what she spent most of her money on. Even though the apartment complex she lived in wasn't the nicest around, it didn't mean she couldn't have nice things. It helped that Mr. Jameer, who owned the building and leased directly, a novelty these days, took pride in it. And she, in turn, took pride in her apartment. Which was why, even though she was busy with work most of the time, her apartment stayed immaculate. The interior looked like a room straight out of Better Homes and Gardens. It helped that she never had anyone over, she thought, trying to spin it optimistically. That's right, they'd only mess it up. Eat your heart out, HGTV. She often thought with a smile. Lighting a couple candles, everything was almost perfect. Almost. Her stomach rumbled, and she knew what was missing right away. She needed a bread and cheese tray. Nothing like wine and charcuterie. Maybe she'd even bring a book in the bath with her. Then she thought against it, opting for one of the audiobooks she'd bought on her phone instead. Buying books off the Oprah Book Club was another one of her guilty pleasures. Amongst other things, she thought, reminding herself that she had picked up another one of those steamy Highlander books. But she'd need to drink a lot more wine before she read that. Much more wine. Opening the fridge, she screamed and jumped back. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. It looked like a blanket of something was moving on top of her food. But then it became clear. Her fridge top to bottom was covered in cockroaches. They'd gotten into her bread, cheese, everything. The worst part of it was they didn't scatter when the light came. Instead, they hissed at her. Brittany slammed the door, hearing a sickening crunch as several of the bugs were smashed inside the door. She felt like she was going to throw up. She opened up her sink cabinet, rooting around for a can of Raid or anything she could use to kill those damn things. Just as her hand closed around it, she felt something skitter next to her hand. Dropping the can, she ran out of her apartment and went across the hall. There, she banged on the door until Frank opened it. She'd never really asked what Frank did for a living. She just knew he was always home. And even though she knew he had some sort of crush on her, she often had him over to fix stuff. Mostly because the actual Super Will was kind of a creep, and always was working on getting drunk or sobering up. Frank rubbed his eyes and put his glasses on. "Brittany? What's wrong?" he asked, looking around the hall, clearly confused. And then down at her. He quickly blushed and looked away. Brittany looked down and turned red herself, realizing that the front of her robe had fallen open, giving Frank a show. "Sorry," she said, and quickly retied it. "Frank, do you have anything to kill roaches?" He smiled. "Yeah, I should have a can of Raid around here somewhere. Don't think I've ever had to use it in this building. Pretty surprising. Living in the city, I've always had to use at least one can on hand," he told her conversationally as he walked deeper into his apartment, going to root about for the can, giving her a wide-open view to the inside of his apartment. She was surprised that it was so clean. Since he dressed like he was still in college, with graphic t-shirts and shorts, along with the occasional hoodies being his go-to apparel, Brittany always assumed that his living conditions would reflect that. Instead, she was greeted with a tidy apartment furnished in a very modern way, with way more technology lying around than actual furniture. A large TV sat on one wall, and the other looked to be multiple computers, with several screens spread across a cluster of high-end desks. What the hell does he do? She wondered for the first time. But before she could give it another thought, Frank walked back into the room, grinning ear to ear, holding a can of Raid that had never been opened. "Will this do?" he asked. She nodded. "Will you do it?" she asked him, biting her bottom lip and hating herself for not wanting to go back in there. "Sure, no problem," he told her, clearly trying to keep his eyes from wandering. She'd purposely let her arm slide down so the robe fell open a little more. Usually she wouldn't be this manipulative, but she really didn't want to go back over there. "Where are they at?" he asked, his face turning more than a little red. "In the fridge," Brittany told him, opening her apartment door and pointing across the room at the offending object. Frank walked across the room looking for any signs of roaches and opened the fridge. He'd always hated bugs, and what he saw now made him want to run right back out the door. But with Brittany standing there watching him, there was no way in hell he was going to do that. The roaches in the fridge hissed at him. Not to mention they were unfazed by the light, something he'd never seen before and didn't want to think about. In fact, if he didn't know better for a minute, he thought they actually started moving away from the food and towards him. Almost like they weren't scared of him at all. Lifting the can with one hand and cover his mouth and nose with the other, he sprayed. The roaches fell out around his feet, giving their last death throes. The survivors booked it, pouring out past him and disappearing into the vents. As though they knew what was happening. He swallowed. That was definitely weird. Frank had seen roaches in an apartment before, but he'd never seen that many all at once. And inside the fridge. He shuddered and decided tonight he was going to make sure everything he owned was sealed up tight. If they were in one apartment this high up, then they were in the entire building. Locating her broom, he swept up the dead roaches and threw them in the trash. Then he sprayed around her vents and other entry points, saving enough so that he could do the same with his own apartment. Already dreading the phone call he'd have to make to Mr. Jameer first thing in the morning. He'd probably still make Will spray first, but at this point, Frank was pretty sure they were going to have to call a real exterminator. "Thanks," Brittany told him, smiling and tucking a stray strand of her dark hair back behind her ear. "No problem. Are you going to be okay?" he asked her. "Actually," Brittany started, "would it be okay if I crashed at your place tonight?" His first thought went to Candy, not sure how she'd feel about it. But he figured she'd understand. "Sure," he told her and tried to play it cool. Platonic or not, it had been a long time since any woman had stayed over. Even though when he used to think of Brittany spending the night, it was under way different circumstances, ones that had never once involved cockroaches. 6. Will Jemison was tired, mostly because for once he was up before noon, which was an odd occurrence for him. One that he really hoped wasn't going to start becoming a habit. Scratching his head, he walked to the door doing his best to shake off the hangover that resulted from too many beers and a couple bottles of Mad Dog, all because some woman saw a bug or some shit. Now he had to suffer through it. His apartment, a studio on the first floor, was in its usual disarray. The floor was littered with takeout boxes and empty bottles of bourbon, Mad Dog, and whatever else was on sale at the liquor store. Unable to ignore the constant ringing of his phone, he finally answered and was rewarded with the angry voice of the landlord, who quickly reminded him he lived rent-free because he was supposed to be the building super. He only half listened as Mr. Jamie went through his usual spiel about how he had to do a better job, and then got on to the actual point of what he was supposed to do. Grab the spray and fumigate one of the units. Then do a thorough walkthrough of the entire building to ensure it wasn't part of a larger infestation. The last thing that Mr. Jameer wanted to do was have to hire an outside exterminator. Will knew that the unspoken line there was that he didn't want to have to pay for it. A building like this would cost a good chunk of change to spray. Not to mention what the follow-up costs would be. Once you started paying an exterminator for commercial properties, they were just as hard to get rid of as the bugs. Bugs. He thought about it for a moment. He'd never seen any bugs in this building. If there was, it sure as hell wasn't his fault. He sprayed around the place every month, just like he had for years. If there were really bugs in this building, then someone brought them in and that was that. Let them pay for it, instead of making it his problem, like everything else in this building. What was he anyway? A damn exterminator now. The usual maintenance took up enough time as it was, without adding more to it. If there was an actual infestation, there wasn't much he could do anyway, not unless they got some serious chemicals. Ones that free rent or not, he didn't want to touch. Will might be a wreck of a man, but he wasn't stupid. He knew too many people that died way too young from taking unnecessary job risks when it came to hazardous chemicals on a job site. Let the professionals handle it, he thought, almost completely forgetting his run-in with Frank the other day. You'd think some people had never seen a roach before. All they had to do was spray some Raid and move on, but apparently some folks couldn't get that through their thick heads, so now it was his problem. He was already coming up with a plan as he walked out, spray a little like he usually did, and then bam, off to the bar he'd go. Last thing he wanted to do was waste his whole day chasing roaches around like some sort of smuck. He really couldn't believe it. Show me a building in all of Baltimore without creepy crawlies in the ducts, and he'd eat his socks. Stopping only long enough to lock his door, just in case any of the young kids in the building got any wild ideas. Never could be too careful these days. Every day the news had another report of some young upstart doing something crazy. As soon as he turned around, he bumped into Harry, or as everyone in the building called him, Sarge. Harry Johnson was an older African-American man. A cop who'd put in his time on the force when Baltimore was dropping enough bodies every week to make Chicago blush. Now he just collected his pension and kept his eyes on the building, acting like the unofficial security guard. Truth be told, he was one of the few people in the building that Will actually liked, probably because he was the only tenant who wasn't a colossal pain in the ass to deal with. And it helped that Sarge was basically a fifth-a-day bourbon drinker. It wasn't his favorite drink, but Will had long ago made a point of never turning down a free drink. Plus, they both liked to go over to Flannery's, a diner and dive bar that served as a hangout for most of the hardy drinkers in the neighborhood. "Morning, Will," Sarge said as he walked down the hallway. He moved a little slower than usual. His arthritis was probably acting up. Will thought sadly, a reminder that he wasn't exactly a spring chicken himself. "Morning, Sarge. Say, you see any roaches in your place?" Will asked, his voice making it clear that he hoped he hadn't. Sarge shook his head. "Can't say I have." Will grunted. "Probably nothing. Lady on the 5th floor is complaining about them, but I ain't seen one." Sarge laughed. "You know how it is with women. Everything with legs is a roach or a rat." Will returned the laugh. "Tell me about it, but now I've got to go check it out." Sarge nodded. "Well, have fun. You want to go out for a drink later? Heard Flannery's has a special tonight with steaks and everything," he said with a little whistle at the end. Will's stomach rumbled just at the thought of it. "Sounds good to me. I'll come by after I take care of a whole lot of nothing." Thinking about the sad state of his own refrigerator's contents, he wished he could head over there now. Sarge waved him off as Will made his way heading back towards the basement. Unsure of exactly what he was about to walk in on. He couldn't believe that this was another one of those false calls, and on a day when he should be off relaxing at the bar, instead of stomping around in the damn basement. Damn it, all this work for a couple of bugs. Little tiny bugs that don't harm anyone. Half the apartments in this city had roaches, he reminded himself again. Hell, they practically came with the building. And if the people who lived here took more pride in how they lived instead of trashing their apartments, maybe they'd have fewer problems with bugs. Maybe if they bought some bug spray instead of expecting the landlord to do everything, then Will could eat a fucking steak at Flannery's at a decent time, instead of looking for bugs that probably didn't even exist. The basement was unlocked, at least the part he was supposed to go into. That worked out pretty well, because he'd forgotten his keys upstairs. Last thing he needed, though, was for the owner to know that, though. Jesus, the last time he'd forgotten the keys somewhere he'd almost been fired, didn't scare him as much, though. After all, he was pretty drunk then, too. Should have brought a bottle down here, then it would have been a good day. Oh well, at least he had Flannery's to look forward to. Nothing better than ogling servers and drinking bottom-shelf booze. Will didn't believe in heaven, but to him, that had to be as close as you could get to it. As soon as he flipped the light switch, he saw some little shape skitter across the ground. Damn it. He swore now he'd actually have to do his job. If he got a steak tonight, it wouldn't be until later. If Mr. Jameer came down here and saw roaches run across the floor like that, it would cost him his job. On the other side of the basement door, which only really held the boiler and some resident storage cages, there was a janitor's closet inside of which were some foggers and other bug repellent. They did the yearly set-offs that all apartment buildings in the city were supposed to do, and even paid an exterminator for a yearly inspection. Which even then, Mr. Jameer hated to do. Though, Will thought they'd gotten off lucky until now because this building, as long as he'd lived here, never had a serious infestation. There were still a couple of those kill boxes left. Little plastic traps which held food pellets the roaches shared and would kill them all. Well, that's what the box promised anyway. Will hadn't ever actually got to test them yet. Though he was looking forward to it, like most people, he took a little glee from eliminating pests. He took them out of the box and sat them in the corners of the room like the box said to. For a moment, he thought about going upstairs and putting some in Brittany's apartment, but she would be at work around now. Or at least she should be. Not to mention, he didn't want to explain how the pellets work if she found them. He'd never really liked Brittany. She always seemed to look down on him and everyone else in the building for that matter. Until she needed something that was, then she'd come yelling and fussing. No, if she wanted traps, she'd have to go buy her own. That made him happy. He was turning, already thinking about that steak, when he felt something bite his ankle. What the hell? He swore and slapped down. There was a meaty crunch, and his hand was covered in a viscous green goo, a flattened crunchy roach body glued to his hand. Roaches didn't bite. Did they? Will wondered, but not for long because another bite followed it, and then another. He was slapping his legs, killing them with every strike, but he could hear them now. They came out behind the boiler, hell, they came out everywhere. A flood of little brown shells, legs and antennae and terrible little biting mouths. "Jay, get off me," he yelled, slapping his body wildly, wishing to God that he'd grabbed some of those cans of Raid. They were crawling up his body as fast as he could kill them. Their tiny bodies exploring every crack and crevice of his own. He screamed as he felt one climb up his neck and force its way into his ear. He could hear every step it made, breath it took as it crawled into his skull. As he screamed, hundreds more poured into his mouth like an angry tide, their legs scratching against his tongue and gums as they dragged their bodies deeper into his throat, biting as they went. So many so that he couldn't close his mouth as more and more of them crawled inside him, closing off his airway until all he saw was black. 7. Candy sighed as more and more dings echoed from her computer. Not that she hated sitting on her bed in lingerie, wearing a pink wig and Venusian mask. It was just that she could think of better things to be doing with her time. Like getting Frank to come out of his shell, or out of his apartment in general for that matter. Hanging out with him the other night had been fun, more fun than she'd had with a guy in a long time. He was a decent sort, and in her line of work, that was something she rarely met. Candy knew how infrequently a decent man actually came along in life. It had been years since she'd come across one, and more than that one, that was okay with her chosen profession. The money from camming, though, was a lot more than she would have made with her unfinished English degree. More than a few people she'd gone to school with were still scraping by in the same service industry jobs that they'd had as an undergrad. And at times it was fun, even though most of the men and women who watched her were complete creeps. She did, however, appreciate the ones that only wanted to see her feet, mainly because it took little to no effort on her part, plus they were always big tippers. Very big tippers, she thought, looking over at the large TV that stretched almost to each corner of her apartment wall. "Come on, guy's show doesn't start until 5,000 coins," she said with a fake smile, waving a toy that was all sorts of unproportional in front of the camera. If Frank hadn't fixed her laptop for her, she'd have been screwed, just not literally tonight. This show would pay her rent for the next few months, and then some. Unlike most in her profession, Candy was squirrely with saving her money, and hated to spend it if she didn't have to. And she'd made quite a lot of it, in fact. But she also realized that there was only so long she could do this. Eventually, she'd be aged out. And then it'd all be about her savings and investments. Not only did she make a revenue off the live shows, the clips from them she edited the scenes later, all of which sold like hotcakes. Add in a couple of superscription-based social media accounts, and Candy cleaned up really well. The problem, though, was her own paranoia, which is why it wasn't really a deal-breaker for her that Frank was so agoraphobic. With every new subscriber and follower throwing cash at her, it made going out that much more terrifying. She'd heard the horror stories of other women being outed, stalked, and worse by obsessive fans. And all it took was one look at her business email to show that she had more than a few of those. Hundreds of emails that contained threats, offers to meet in person, and some of her viewers' daydreams that were scarier than any horror movie that she'd ever seen. She shuddered at the thought of a few of them. No, she didn't hold it against Frank at all. She'd just have to take her time with him, that was all. Ding. Ding. 4,800. She might need to lube up for this one, she thought, looking at the toy and smiling coyly at the camera. Another ding. 4,850. She wasn't doing a good job promoting herself tonight. Truth be told, she just wasn't in the mood. Something that seemed to happen more and more lately. Maybe it was time to take a vacation somewhere far away. She could even try to coerce Frank into taking a cruise, she thought, smiling wickedly. Her mind scrambling for ways that she could get him away from his apartment, because he wasn't the only one that needed to get out. She needed a vacation too, not just from her apartment but also from Baltimore. Far away from her laptop and her fans, just for a little while. Something skittered loudly in her kitchen. But through the blue glow of the Christmas lights that draped her walls, she couldn't make it out. Her computer dinged angrily, letting her know it was time for the big show, as she stood up and out of the way of the webcam, but she didn't care. Then she flipped on the light switch. Candy wasn't squeamish. She wasn't the type of woman to scream at spiders, rats, and snakes. But looking at the horde of roaches all over her countertops, eating into her cereal boxes, and crawling over everything in her kitchen like they owned the place, made her want to be sick. Instead, she shut the laptop just as it dinged a few more times. Logging her out of cam chat stars, fuck it, let them have their coins back. Then she threw on a silk robe, sitting on the bed and circumventing the kitchen as she walked outside. Going down the hall, she pounded on Will's door. "Will, answer the door, you old drunk," she said, banging on the door, surprised that he hadn't opened it by now. Will was a perv who tried to come to her apartment under the guise of fixing something just about every week. A harmless old drunken perv, but a perv nonetheless. There was still no answer, nothing from the other side either. Usually she could hear him moving takeout boxes and slowly trudging towards his door. Was he out? The thought of Will having something better to do than be home on a weeknight was soul-crushing. Damn, at least there was one other person she knew who'd be at this time of night. As she walked down to the elevator, Sarge opened his door just a crack. "Girl, what are you doing causing such a ruckus this time of night?" he asked. Candy sighed. "Sorry, Sarge, I didn't mean to wake you. There are roaches all over my kitchen. Will was supposed to do something about it." Sarge looked perplexed. "And he's not in his place?" "No, he didn't open the door." "Why?" Sarge shrugged. "I don't know. He was supposed to meet me down at Flannery's and never showed. If he's not at the bar or his apartment, I can't think of where he'd be. You say he was supposed to take care of some roaches down in the laundry room, right?" "That's right. Mr. Jameer told him to do it yesterday. I can't imagine he'd wait to do it at night." Sarge chuckled. "It's probably nothing. We'll most likely set off a bunch of foggers in the basement, chasing the bastards upstairs into the apartments. Thanks for the heads up. I'm going to spray my place with Raid." "Anytime, Sarge, and if you see Will, can you give him a swift kick in the ass for me?" Candy asked him. He laughed. "Of course, Miss Candy, anything for you. Good night now." "Good night, Sarge," Candy said, stepping into the elevator and hitting the button that would take her up to the 4th floor. Wondering what Frank was up to, maybe the night wasn't ruined after all, she thought, her face breaking into a smile that was just for herself. 8. Frank was trying to fall asleep on the couch, but was finding it really difficult. He couldn't remember the last time he had someone else staying in his apartment, especially not someone of the opposite sex. He couldn't shake the downright giddy feeling he had in his stomach. He felt like a teenager all over again. Brittany was snoring softly in the other room when there was a sudden knock at his door. With a yawn, he got up, checking the time. It was well into the night. He couldn't believe that anyone would knock on his door at this hour. Getting up, he opened it, and then rubbed his eyes to make sure what he was seeing was real. Candy was standing there wearing what looked like nothing more than a robe, a very flimsy one at that. Frank couldn't help but wonder if he'd stepped into an episode of The Outer Limits, because stuff like this never happened to guys like him, not in real life at least. "Can I come in, or are you going to stand there gawking at me?" Candy asked him with a small smile on her face. "Frank, who is it?" Brittany called out from the bedroom. Candy looked at him, and her eyes got wide. He saw there was hurt there, and mentally kicked himself. He should have texted her or something to let her know what was happening. So he quickly told her. "Brittany's crashing here because she found roaches in her apartment." "So she's staying in your bed while her bug problem gets handled?" Candy asked icily. Frank had never been good with women, and didn't for the life of him understand why Candy seemed to be so angry. "Yeah, I didn't think it would be right to put her on the couch, so I'm sleeping out here," he told her, still somewhat confused. And just like that, Candy's anger seemed to vanish, and she shook her head. "You really are an idiot, you know that," she told him. Sure, I guess," Frank replied, as Brittany walked out of the bedroom. She was wearing one of Frank's t-shirts. And little else. He couldn't help but stare, just a little. "Candy, what are you doing up here this time of night?" she asked, sounding a little aggressive to Frank. Her arms folded in front of her as she stared Candy down. Candy tossed back some of her blonde curly hair. "There are bugs in my apartment. That idiot will apparently set off foggers or something, and now they're all over my kitchen." "Gross." "They were in mine too," Brittany said, and then brightened. "If Will set off foggers, then maybe they're no longer in there," she said happily, prancing across the apartment. "Yeah, maybe," Candy said, glaring at her, not moving from Frank's side. Brittany pressed herself against Frank, giving Candy a dirty look as she kissed him on the cheek. "Thanks for everything. See you around, Frank." "Oh, okay. Have a good night," he stuttered as she walked out of the apartment, tossing her hair in a huff as she passed Candy. Candy glared daggers at Frank. "You should be careful with women like her." "What?" he asked quickly. "There's nothing going on with me and Brittany." "She's a mean girl," Candy told him. "I'm sure you know the type." He did, but his experience with the opposite sex had been severely lacking for quite a while. Candy was probably right. If he thought of it, the dream of Brittany was probably better than the reality. She hadn't exactly been nice to him before Candy came over. So he quickly changed the subject. Anything to get Candy to not be mad at him. "I'm going to call management and get them to send an exterminator. A real one this time," he told her, and hastily made the call. Mr. Jameer acted as though he'd been expecting the call. Perhaps, knowing all too well how thorough Will actually was when it came to his work. It was a short call, and Candy was still staring at him as though she'd come to some kind of decision. "Is there something between you and Brittany?" he asked her, wondering if there was some sort of dispute that he wasn't aware of. It wouldn't be the first time he'd wandered into a neighborly spat without realizing it. The only difference was, in this case, one person was his direct neighbor, and the other, well, was his friend. Candy shook her head and smiled. "No, us girls just don't play nice, that's all. And girls like Brittany like taking things that aren't theirs to take, you know?" "Sure," Frank said, but he really didn't. "If you need a place to stay tonight, you can have the bed," he told her, completely oblivious. She smiled and nodded. "Tonight, I think we can both take the bed," she told him. "What?" Frank asked, finally catching up, his jaw hitting the floor as Candy dropped her robe to the floor and walked towards him. Not trusting himself to not say something stupid, Frank quickly followed her lead, locking the door and following her to his bedroom. All thoughts of sleep were gone from his mind. 9. For just a moment, Brittany wished she'd fucked Frank, not because she liked him, but because she knew that she could have. That, and she didn't like the look that Candy had given her. Brittany had never really gotten along with other women. It wasn't her fault that guys tended to like her better than them. After a quick and somewhat thorough look through her apartment, she was happy to see that it was indeed bug-free. Will Jemison might be a screw-up, but he'd at least done something right for once. And Brittany wasn't going to lose any sleep over all those roaches being in Candy's apartment. In fact, it kind made her feel better in a way. How dare that bitch judge her? Maybe she'd get a little tipsy tonight and go back over to Frank's place by returning his shirt. The thought of the face he'd make if she took it off in front of him made her laugh a little. Her last bottle of wine had been in the apartment the same time the bugs had been, and in her rush to get out, she'd forgotten to recork it. So with a sigh, she poured that down the sink, and instead pulled a bottle of vodka out of the freezer and shimmied into a tight-fitting pair of yoga pants before deciding what she wanted to use as a mixer. For that, though, she'd have to go to the drink machine on the first floor. Taking the elevator down, she had to admit the building was somewhat old and creepy downstairs. There was a flickering light over the drink machine, giving everything a bad B-movie vibe. Not that she cared, though it wasn't the first time she'd come down in the middle of the night for a mixer, and it certainly wouldn't be her last. She put her money in and waited for the off-brand lemon-lime soda to drop out. The manager of the building was too cheap to use name-brand drinks, though he charged the same price for them. Not that she really cared. After all, by the time she was finished loading it up with everything else, it would taste like carbonated vodka and lime. "Brittany?" a voice asked. She spun around defensively and then sighed. It was only Sergeant Harry, as he liked to be called. Rarely did she see him out of his apartment, though she chalked that up to him being a senior and her working late hours. Even though they had limited interaction, she'd always appreciated SGT. Harry, he was a retired cop and liked to act like building security from time to time. And even though she liked to think that she could take care of herself no matter what, Brittany did find it comforting to know that a retired police officer kept an eye on things in the building. "You're sure up late tonight, Sarge," she commented as came out farther into the light. Looking up at the flickering bulb, he muttered, "Will needs to fix that as well. Will needs to fix a lot of things around here. Maybe if you two stopped going to the bar all the time, he could," Brittany said jokingly. Sarge waved her off. Yeah, I don't go with him all the time." "Have you seen him around?" "I've been looking for him," Sarge asked her. Brittany shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe check the basement. Wasn't he supposed to take care of the roaches down there?" she asked him. He nodded. "Yeah, I was just hoping I wouldn't have to walk down there. My knees ain't what they used to be, that's for sure. You seen Ansari around? He lives in that big apartment down there. Maybe he'll know what's going on." Brittany laughed. "Don't let Ansari hear you call it an apartment. He calls it his laboratory," she told him conspiratorially. Both Sarge and her laughed. "There's something off about that man," he told her seriously. She shrugged. "Definitely, he's harmless though. If you see Will, tell him I said thanks for taking care of the roaches," she told him. "Sure thing," Sarge told her. "You have a good night now," he said as she walked away. She gave him a little over-the-shoulder wave, confident that he was probably going to continue his search, even though Will was most likely at the bar across the street. She smiled. This was probably the most fun that Sarge had in years. Finally, back upstairs, Brittany wasted no time getting her drink together and chugging it down. One glass became two, which turned into three. The vodka giving her a heady sensation as she massaged herself, thinking about Frank. Part of her wanted to head back over there and tear his clothes off just to prove a point. The other part of her wanted to lie there and sleep as she drank straight from the bottle. She passed out around the same time she climaxed, legs quivering on the couch. When Brittany woke up, she immediately knew that something was wrong. She felt an itchy, burning sensation between her legs that wasn't right. It wasn't her first time flicking her own bean, and she knew she hadn't been rough. Throwing off the blanket, she saw a bit of blood on her thigh. "What the fuck?" she said, still a little buzzed from the vodka. Brittany could feel it now, something forcing its way deeper inside of her. She reached down and into herself, hyperventilating a little as she pulled out the offending creature. A big nasty-looking roach which tried to squirm out of her hand. A roach had crawled inside of her. Brittany opened her mouth to scream, but then doubled over in pain. She could feel them now. Really feel them inside her, their legs crawling and antennae rubbing up against her organs. Then the pain became more intense. She could feel them biting her from the inside. She started to choke as something crawled up her throat from the opposite direction. She threw up, blood and roaches erupted from her mouth. The ones already inside of her began eating their way out. Brittany screamed as she could visibly one crawling around the skin of her stomach as she threw off the shirt and ran for the bathroom. The motion stirring the creatures up even worse as they moved around inside of her. Crying and choking at the same time, Brittany tripped, her head bouncing off the side of the tub with a sickening crack as the roaches continued to feed. 10. Harry, or Sarge as everyone called him, was really feeling his age as he made it down the stairs. He couldn't believe, though, not for a minute, that Will had stood him up to go across to the bar. Harry was just about the only friend that man had, and when it came to drinking and eating, despite all his other flaws, Will was always punctual. Harry had worked enough missing persons and homicides to know what to look for when something wasn't right. And something here definitely wasn't right. People like Will were driven by habits and patterns. He wouldn't cancel his afternoon drinking session without a heads up. Or more likely, a grab me a six-pack on your way back call. He hoped his friend was okay, but deep down Harry thought that something had to be wrong. While he honestly doubted any sort of foul play, he couldn't rule out Will's health. While Harry was definitely the older of the two, Will wasn't exactly a spring chicken, and he knew from personal experience that a red meat and whiskey diet didn't do an aging man any favors. Truth be told, he thought that Will probably had a heart attack or some related health issue. He'd complained about chest pains often enough. The best thing he could do now for his friend was to find the body before it decomposed. That way he could still have a nice funeral. Harry had seen what happened to those who didn't get found right away. Barely even tell they were human once the rats and other vermin got them. No, he wouldn't let a friend of his go through that. He'd make sure Will went in the ground intact. He hadn't wanted to tell Brittany that, though. That girl already seemed like she had a lot on her mind. Last thing he wanted to do was add to it. Plus, she didn't seem the type to offer her help anyway. At worst, she'd either get in the way or blow the whole thing out of proportion. The basement door was unlocked, and so was the janitor's closet. That wasn't exactly unexpected. Anyone who knew Will knew the man lost his keys all the time and that these doors stayed unlocked. One reason Harry didn't store anything important down here in the first place. Ansari's place was right across the hall. So instead of wandering through the basement, he figured he should start there first. After all, the man was supposed to be a doctor. At least, that's what he told anyone who would listen. Though most of them only did it out of kindness for an old man who seemed down on his luck. People like Harry, Will, and Frank. Ansari was probably too smart for his own good and didn't know how to play the game, so to speak. Couldn't deal with people not operating on his level. Harry had seen similar guys in his time. Most of them ended up right where Ansari did, doing whatever they could to scrape by. Barely making ends meet and telling anyone who'd listen how great they were, and the world was just too dumb to understand them. Which meant he was just another nutty recluse with more diplomas than sense to Harry's way of thinking. He knocked on Ansari's door. There was no answer. Which was odd, since Ansari never left the place. He got everything he needed delivered. He'd tell anyone that would listen that he didn't have time to leave because of how it would affect his work. So why wasn't he answering the door? Harry got that old familiar feeling he'd get back when he used to walk the beat right before something happened. Ansari, open up, it's Harry. He knocked, trying again. Still no answer. Pressing his ear to the door, he could hear the TV on in the other room. But no sounds of movement or even breathing for that matter. What were the odds that Ansari and Will were both not answering their doors on the same day? He didn't believe in such things as coincidences. He'd been on the job for too many years to believe in anything as foolish as that. Harry weighed his options and fished into his trouser pocket, only to come up empty. Just like usual, he'd left his cell phone back upstairs in his apartment. Something that he had a rather nasty habit of doing. He couldn't help it. How had his granddaughter put it? Some old dogs just can't learn new tricks. And how right she was. Now, the one time he actually needed it, he didn't have it. He thought, mentally kicking himself. If Ansari was in trouble, he couldn't waste his time running upstairs to grab his damn cell phone. Besides, he was on the force long enough to know that average response time around the city. Not to mention that unless there were a body, his call would be marked low priority. They'd be lucky to get someone to drop by in the next 5 hours, or whenever shift change was now. No, he'd have to do this one just like they'd done in the old days. Harry just hoped that he wouldn't displace his hip. Last thing he wanted was another trip to the physical therapist. Luckily for him, even for such a private guy, Ansari's door and locks were pretty cheap. It swung open with a second kick, which was good. Even though he had his adrenaline pumping, Harry really didn't think he had a third kick in him. Not in this lifetime, anyway. Standing out of breath in the doorway, he couldn't help but think how easy breaching a door used to be 10-20 years ago. Back when he could do that, chase down a perp, and then finish the rest of his 14-hour shift. Even from the doorway, though, he could tell that something was seriously wrong. Ansari's place was a complete and utter wreck. Smashed glass terrariums covered the floors. And everything in sight was covered in a goo, which if he wasn't too far off was roach shit. But it was what was in the middle of the room that kept his attention. There between the smashed terrariums was a skeleton, gleaming white and picked clean. Now he had to go get his cell phone. As Harry was backing up, he heard what sounded like hundreds of tiny hisses all at once. The closest he could compare it to was a bunch of little tea kettles about to go off. The sound was like nothing he'd ever heard before. Then there were hundreds of roaches pouring out of every crack and crevice, coming right at him like a tide hitting the shore. The only thing that saved him was the muscle memory from all his years on the force. When the mind locked up, the body reacted, and you always trusted your instincts. Harry had seen that save many a man's life in his time. He ran back into the hallway and bolted up the stairs to the first floor, hip be damned. But just as fast as he ran, those things kept coming swarming up the walls to get at him. He hit the elevator full force. While he waited, he ripped the fire extinguisher off of the wall and pulled the pin. Hoping to God that Will had actually done his job and checked these things from time to time. As soon as he pulled the pin and squeezed the lever, he smiled and thanked the Lord, as a cold, foamy chemical shot out of the nozzle and covered the advancing bugs, barely stemming the tide as they froze and died, writhing in the cold foam. Their comrades pushing up over their dead bodies to get at Harry as they poured up from the stairwell. Some of the smarter ones, realizing he was focusing on the floor, began to cover the walls and even the ceiling. Harry windmilled the nozzle as best he could to keep them at bay. He sprayed until the can was empty, then he tossed that at them too. Resorting to squishing the ones that fell around him in a maniacal tap dance, his hands flailing, knocking them off his shoulders and sleeves in an effort to keep them far away from his face. He didn't know what had happened down there, but it didn't take a cop, even a retired one, to realize that these roaches were behind it. The elevator dinged, and he jumped in, quickly mashing the button for his floor and the door shut mechanism at the same time. He sighed in relief as the elevator started to speed upwards. The overhead lights began to flicker, and he could hear the hissing just outside of his elevator. The small crunching sounds of the crushed bodies as they sacrificed their own to get at him. There was a sound as the elevator rose, almost like hail hitting the roof. Whatever it was coming from above him. Harry watched in horror as the sound grew louder, like a veritable storm in the elevator shaft. The emergency hatch on the roof bowed inwards. He screamed as the hatch gave way, and a full-on flood of roaches filled the elevator, without Harry having any place to escape to. In shock, he realized he was still screaming, and then the only thing he could think about was how differently everything might have gone if he'd just called it in. After all, he was supposed to be retired. He thought as roaches descended over him, swallowing him from sight. 11. Frank was lying on his bed with Candy draped over him. If he'd had a hard time sleeping a little while ago, there wasn't a chance in hell that he was going to get any now. And while Candy's breathing was steady, She let out a little giggle every now and again that let him know she was still awake too. "What's so funny?" he asked her. "It's just I hadn't expected you to be." "I don't know." "Good," she said, smiling at him and biting his chest in a way that made him wince in a good way. Frank gulped and tried to think of something witty to say. He was way out of his depth here, and they both knew it. Playing it cool wasn't exactly one of Frank's skills. "Oh, thanks," was the best he could come up with. "You're welcome," she said with another small laugh. Frank saw the gleam in her eye that said they were about to start round 3, when the most blood-curdling scream he'd ever heard came rattling down the hall. "Who the hell was that?" Candy asked him, jumping up and putting on his shirt. He shrugged. "I don't know, but that barely sounded human. Whoever that was, I don't think it was a joke," he told her. "Should we check it out?" Candy asked him. "Brittany may have found another bug and need you to squish it," she teased. "Ha ha, but I guess we could check on her," he said, feeling a little more sure of himself, though he doubted that a roach had made someone scream like that. The sound had been, well, he didn't want to think of what that sounded like. Candy grabbed a lighter from her purse and a can of body spray off the dresser. He shot her a look. She shrugged. "What it isn't like you have a can of Raid lying around anymore, and besides, we're gonna need to update your cologne anyway." She had him there, but if they were going armed, he might as well grab the bat from beside the door. Together, they stepped out into the hallway, shocked at how eerily silent the entire building seemed to be. Not that it was super unusual, after all. Sunny Glades had always been a rather quiet building as far as apartments went, but this was beyond that. Even on an average night, there would be sounds somewhere of people living their lives, crying, coughing, moaning. But this was downright eerie. Ignoring Candy's questioning look, Frank stepped back inside and grabbed his cell phone. Dialing 911, he told the operator about the screaming. In response, he was told they'd send someone when they had time. "Just in case," Frank told her. Candy shrugged. "I wasn't judging. Something feels off. Worst case scenario, they tell one of our darling neighbors to shut the hell up." Sliding his phone into his pocket, he set off across the hall and knocked on the door to Brittany's apartment. There was no answer. He thought about calling out, but for some reason couldn't bring himself to do it. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. Before he could talk himself out of it, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. Surprised to find it unlocked. Maybe she'd been waiting for Will or had just stepped out to grab something from the vending machines. He wondered. They walked inside and immediately were confronted with a charnel meat smell and something else. Something cloying that reminded him of the reptile house at the zoo. A musty, musky smell that seemed to assault them from every direction. Frank coughed and covered his nose, hoping Candy would stop them from going further. But she didn't. Instead, he felt her small hand press on the middle of his back, urging him forward. Maybe it was her, or that they'd just spent what Frank was already considering being the best night of his life together, but for the first time he felt brave. And he hated himself for it, because deep down he knew that whatever they found here wasn't going to be good. What shocked him more than the smell was the state of the place. On the few times he'd been over to help her with minor issues, her apartment had always been immaculate. Now Brittany's usually clean apartment was, well, a disaster. It was clear from the state of the kitchen that she had pest problems. If Will had scared them up from the basement, it looked like they'd picked her apartment to rummage through first. But it was the living room that drew most of their attention. Her otherwise white couch now had a deep red stain on it. More than you'd get from a spilled bottle of wine. Frank's mouth went dry just looking at it. Candy looked at him and readied her can. There on the floor leading to the bathroom was his borrowed t-shirt. The bathroom door was ajar, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought about leaving and calling the cops back. Letting them know that this was way more than a noise complaint. That moment came and went. Whatever happened here, they had to see it. They were past the point of no return, Frank thought as he crept forward. They'd just check the place out and leave. That way, Frank could give a report to the cops when they showed up. Using the bat, he pushed open the door, and at the sight of what lay on the other side, both of them jumped back. There on the floor was a skeleton. One which they could only assume a couple of hours ago had been Brittany. She was sprawled out beside the tub, what was left of her. The blood on the floor was the only sign that she'd been alive only a few hours ago. Frank didn't know what could do this, and he really didn't want out. "Jesus," Candy muttered, then screamed a little as several roaches skittered across the skeleton. Even Frank was shaken by that. "You don't think?" Frank started, but then stopped himself, not wanting to put his thoughts into actual words. Not when they sounded that crazy. What exactly was Ansari working on in the basement? Candy asked him, as they both started to slowly back up. He shrugged. He was a professor. Oh shit, he always used to say it was something about bugs, I don't know. But roaches can't do this, can they? Well, I think we're about to find out, Candy said. The roaches had turned to them now and started advancing. Candy didn't wait to find out their plan. Instead, she flicked the lighter on and turned the can of body spray into a mini torch, burning them into a crisp, blackening part of the skeleton. As she sprayed it wider, they both swore as the flame ended up catching part of the shag carpet on fire. It quickly took, and then spread to the toilet paper and the towels. Shit, that's not good, Frank said, grabbing Candy. He pulled her out of the room, and the two of them ran down the hallway, stopping only long enough to pull the fire alarm. They waited to see if anyone would come out. No one did. It was like the whole building had already cleared out. Or had ended up like Brittany, Frank thought. That's even worse, Candy said. The elevator dinged and opened. Candy pulled Frank back as he walked towards it. Inside was a skeleton covered in roaches, which turned to them as the doors opened. Candy sprayed them, and Frank threw the bat at them. Not that it did much good. The fire was spreading quickly, now pouring out of Brittany's apartment and lapping up the hallway walls as it leisurely spread from room to room. Together, they tore off down the stairs, heading to the first floor. Behind them, roaches followed. Fire alarms blared all around them, yet no one else joined in their mad dash down the stairs. They were completely alone, except for the hundreds of roaches that literally rained down on them from above, hissing and biting. They smacked, crushed, and stomped them as they ran, but for every one they killed, 10 more took its place. Frank could feel as they bit and scratched him from almost every angle, desperately trying to swarm over him and devour them both the same way they had Brittany and everyone else in the building. Candy screamed and came to stop on near the second-floor exit. Roaches were coming up the stairs towards them, trying to cut them off. Whatever the hell Dr. Ansari had done to these things had made them too damn smart. If they could work together to flank their prey, Frank didn't want to know what else they were capable of. Now they were trapped between two enormous groups of roaches, with nowhere else to run. "Do you trust me?" Frank asked Candy. She nodded. He climbed over the stairwell and jumped backward, throwing himself into the opposing wall and the opposite part of the stairwell. It hurt, but it was better than being eaten alive. "Now you," he shouted, arms outstretched. Candy didn't even take the time to think about it. The roaches were almost on her. She did the same thing he had and crashed into him. It wasn't much, but he figured he'd saved her from a twisted ankle, so that was something. Some roaches had jumped with her. He quickly patted them off of her. Sadly, it didn't take the roaches long to regroup. Now the first swarm had joined the second as they continued down the stairs towards them. As the fire spread, it rained dead roaches down on them. The swarm hissed loudly, apparently now realizing the full extent of the danger. He knew they didn't have long to get out. This was an old building, a building in which many of the units still used gas. They ran until they hit the first floor, the entire swarm on their trail. The building rumbled as somewhere up above them, beams and tiles gave way to the flames. If the one of gas lines blew, the whole building would go up in one fell swoop. He wondered if the roaches knew that as well, or if it was just animal instinct that drove them. Either way, he didn't want to find out. The main entrance was in front of them. Candy tripped and fell to the ground. Apparently still hungry, the swarm changed course and went to devour her. She screamed, but before they could engulf her in an endless wave of tiny burrowing teeth, he pulled a fire extinguisher off the wall and let it rip, stopping them in their tracks with a thick flurry of the cold, foamy substance. Before she could say anything, he pulled Candy to her feet and pushed her behind him, spraying the path behind them as they ran towards the front door. He watched in horror as they used their dead as bridges through the foam, driving the ones in front of them into the thick of it so they could then climb over. So much for that, he thought, and tossed the extinguisher at them just as Candy made it out the door. As soon as they were through the door, and he felt the night air hit him, Frank shoved it closed, hearing a sickening crunch as an untold number of roaches was crushed. Then he took off his shirt and shoved it under the doorway, packing it in as tightly as he could, just as the swarm of insects crashed into it. He could hear them hissing louder as the door window filled with smoke. "Will that hold them?" Candy asked. Just as he was about to answer, the window above them blew out in a billow of flame. They ran back as a chain reaction of explosions rocked through the building. Behind them they could hear sirens. All thoughts of the roaches were gone as they ran as fast as their legs could take them. Already he could make out first responders setting up far away from the building. They almost made it when they were propelled forward by a massive explosion. His ears were ringing as he and Candy were dragged to safety by EMTs. They could only watch as firefighters ran forward towards the still-burning blackened skeleton of a building. "What are you going to do now that you finally left the building?" Candy asked him as an EMT wrapped them in blankets. "I think I'm moving," he said with a grim laugh. One she shared as she leaned over and kissed him. "I hear they don't have bug problems in Alaska," she offered. "As long as you come along to keep me warm." "Deal," Candy said, as the helicopters and army of even more first responders poured into the site, watching as they attempted to get the fire under control. Both of them hoping it would burn just a little longer, knowing that the only other survivors at this point had far too many legs.